Hello everyone, welcome to Kroll's Emerging Threats Weekly Briefing for the 17th of August 2026. I'm Ryan Hicks. With me today is Jeff Deng and Sam Flint from the Threat Intel team. So this week we're covering the following topics on the screen there. So I'm looking at Storm 1175's move to StormEncryptor, and also the latest on Lazarus's Operation Dream Job campaign, kind of ongoing. Jeff's covering the actor Gunra and also LightSpy, and Sam was covering TeamPCP and also SharePoint exploitation for a ransomware attack. So first up, Microsoft have reported that Storm 1175 has resumed activity and is deploying the StormEncryptor instead of Medusa payloads previously associated with the actor. During the attack, researchers noted that the likely entry point is CV 2026-18577, which is a vulnerability in self-hosted Enable N-Central application servers. The observed tool chain includes AnyDesk or Simple Help for remote access, Advanced IP Scanner for discovery, and Mimikatz for LSAS credential thefts before moving on to Exploitation and encryption. The new tool, StormEncryptor, is a C++ locker, impends the .encrypted file extensions, and typically the actor gives victims a short 3-day negotiation window. To note, on the initial access vulnerability that was mentioned, Enable have released several hotfixes. They note that hotfix 2 is required even where hotfix 1 was applied. So for any vulnerable applications, ensure that hotfix 2 is applied regardless of any previous patching actions. So recommendations is, as I mentioned, verifying that those vulnerabilities are updated to the latest vendor recommended hotfix, which is currently hotfix 2. They may add later ones, so ensure that latest is applied. Hunting for kind of remote access tool abuse, LSAS access, unusual service creation, and then reviewing whether those servers the exposure to those can be reduced through network segmentation to reduce the likelihood of that kind of initial access in the first place. Next, so Checkpoint reported on a new Operation Dream Job wave tied to what we track as KTA-071, known as Lazarus. Current activity concentrating on the defense sector. Organizations, particularly aerospace and aviation, observed impacts reportedly currently in Europe and in India. In the first 2 active infection chains, victims were directed to use SecurityPDF, which is a Trojanized PDF viewer. It opens attacker-crafted documents and extracts a new backdoor called Troy. The attackers also used impersonation websites and search optimization to ensure the malware delivery path looks more legitimate to the victims. And the second infection chain that was reported uses the mispen downloader, and that exploited CV 2026-68820, which is a 0-day in Windows AFD.sys to deploy further tooling. Microsoft patched that flaw only recently within the August Patch Tuesday release, so quite a recent quick exploitation of that vulnerability. Researchers also said that the threat actor used compromised round-cube servers as command and control infrastructure, and it was noted that most of the analyzed servers ran versions vulnerable to CV 2025-49113. And noted that actor likely used leak credentials to authenticate before exploiting the flaw in Roundcube, and they installed a new PHP web shell called Relay Shell, and that essentially turns the compromised Roundcube servers into kind of relay infrastructure for actor to victim communications, so as a C2 channel. So recommendations for this: prioritizing kind of Windows updates covering that vulnerability. As mentioned, it was it was only released recently in August Patch Tuesday, looking at kind of detections, hunting for Trojanized PDF readers, DLL sideloading, and any kind of unexpected or suspicious OneDrive or Microsoft Graph API abuse, which was mentioned as a technique, and also on the kind of infrastructure side, auditing internet-facing Roundcube instances. Of course, it wasn't kind of linked to the victim in this particular campaign, but that was a kind of a separate targeting, if you like, to sort of set up this attack. So ensuring that your organizations don't fall foul of becoming C2 servers. So yeah, really auditing those instances for vulnerabilities, and also hunting for any signs of kind of web shell like activity, and also as usual kind of ensuring that any kind of exposure is limited, particularly to internet facing devices. And I'll hand over to Jeff.
Thank you, Ryan. U.S. and South Korean agencies this week warned that KTA-447 Gunra has matured from a single ransomware operation to a ransomware-as-a-service model with global victim coverage. The advisory places Gunra squarely in the current tier of active crews targeting government and critical infrastructure organizations. The group's initial access tradecraft remains heavily focused on exposed edge systems. Authorities said the actors have exploited critical Fortinet authentication flaws, including CVE 2024-55591 and CVE 2025-24472, alongside weaknesses in internet-facing VPN infrastructure and SSH access controls. Gunra is assessed as derived from leaked KTA-147 Conti ransomware code, but the operational development is the more important point this week. The structured affiliate program and recruitment of initial access brokers increased the operation's potential scale and the number of organizations exposed to the same intrusion path. Victims listed on the group's data leak site span from the Americas, Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and the Asia Pacific region. Sectors cited by the advisory include healthcare, financial services, government services, utilities, transportation, academia, manufacturing, media, retail, and professional services. The group remains conventional double extortion, but the operational risk is driven by its focus on edge devices and cross-platform support. Known exploitive appliance flaws remain one of the fastest paths into high-value networks. Recommendations include patch internet-facing Fortinet and VPN infrastructure on an emergency basis where affected versions remain exposed. Validate segmentation and recovery procedures for critical systems, especially in regulated and operationally sensitive environments. Monitor for management contact by external actors, data staging, and other pre-encryption extortion behaviors. Next slide, please. Reporting this week indicates the Chinese link LightSpy platform has broadened well beyond its historical focus on mainland China and is now being used against victims in more than a dozen countries, including targets in Europe and the United States. Researchers assess that LightSpy has evolved into commercial spyware operated by a single threat actor and marketed to governments, enterprises, and militaries. That framing suggests the platform is being positioned as a service capability rather than only a state-run internal toolset. The platform remains highly modular with support for phones, Apple devices, Linux servers, and Windows hosts. The notable development this week is reporting that some infections now involve routers, which would give operators visibility into multiple downstream devices and communications within a targeted network. Some of the targeted routers were reportedly associated with NATO member countries, although the final customers or sponsoring entities behind the activity were not identified. Router compromise changes both visibility and containment. Mobile device spyware is already difficult to detect, but the network edge compromise can extend surveillance, persistent, and follow-on access across a wider device set than a single endpoint infection alone. Recommendations include prioritize patching and configuration review for edge routers in government and high-sensitivity networks, monitor for unexplained management changes, outbound beacons, and credential reuse across router and endpoint layers. Treat router telemetry as part of endpoint and mobile threat hunting, not as a separate network-only problem. Thank you. Handing over to Sam now.
Thanks, Jeff. My first story this week covers new research suggesting that KTA 532, also known as TeamPCP, should not be designated a recently emerged threat actor. Instead, it appears to be the latest iteration of a longer-running operational threat cluster that's been active since at least 2020. The documented overlap includes shared domains, deployment paths, and staging scripts. These connect KTA 532 with earlier activity tracked as TA-NATALSTATUS, as well as with Shadow Ray 2.0 attacks that exposed Ray clusters. This would extend the group's apparent history by several years and points to a more mature, established operation than initial reporting suggested. The same reporting also ties this activity cluster to the first known self-propagating botnet built from hijacked AI infrastructure. That suggests the techniques seen in recent KTA 532 operations were derived from earlier campaigns involving self-propagating attack chains and the exploitation of AI tooling. Researchers identified links spanning infrastructure exploitation, GitHub Actions abuse, token theft, and phishing infrastructure. In one branch observed in late May, they also saw a destructive Kubernetes payload targeting systems configured for the Iran time zone. The research did not determine whether this continuity reflected a direct rebrand, shared operators, or close collaboration. Even so, it suggests a persistent threat actor cluster engaged in disruption, monetization, and supply chain compromise. The findings indicate that KTA 532 is a far more established threat actor than its recent public emergence implied. For organizations, the actor's broad capability set reinforces the need to secure developer tooling, CI/CD pipelines, cloud workloads, and AI platforms as integral parts of the enterprise attack surface. To reduce the risk, organizations should review external exposure and credential controls across CI/CD, artifact, and AI cluster infrastructure. Hunt for reused deployment paths, staging scripts, and unusual automation tokens in developer platforms, and apply stricter network and identity segmentation between build systems, cloud workloads, and production assets. And moving on, a recent SharePoint vulnerability has now progressed from active exploitation to use in ransomware deployment. The Microsoft SharePoint Server deserialization flaw, tracked as CVE 2026-45659, is now being used in ransomware operations, following an update from CISA's known exploited vulnerabilities catalog. The issue was patched in late May and added to the catalog on the 1st of July, but the latest update shows that exploitation has progressed into monetization. The vulnerability is relatively low complexity and requires minimal privileges within on-premise SharePoint instances. This makes it attractive to access brokers seeking reliable enterprise footholds. Researchers noted similarities to previous SharePoint-focused ransomware activity dubbed Toolshell, associated with the China-linked actor Storm 2603. However, no attribution has been made in the current campaign. Although a patch has been available since May and active exploitation has been publicly known since July, vulnerable SharePoint servers continue to provide access to systems that often contain sensitive internal documents, permissions data, and other business-critical information. The progression from patch release to confirmed exploitation and then to ransomware deployment illustrates how quickly widely accessible enterprise platforms can become targets once exploitation techniques mature. Organizations that have not yet remediated exposed SharePoint instances should assume an increased risk of compromise. Defenders should patch or isolate all on-premise SharePoint instances immediately. Review web, authentication, and application logs back to early July for exploitation signs, and rotate credentials and review privileged access tied to SharePoint service accounts. Organizations should also reduce internet exposure and enforce network segmentation around collaboration servers. And that's it from me this week. Back to you, Ryan.
Thanks, Sam, and thanks also, Jeff. So that's all we have for this week. Thanks for tuning into the briefing. If you have any questions, please contact us at cti@kroll.com. Thank you, and see you next week.